Hi everyone, welcome you all back to the Learn Sustainability channel. And today's topic will be on the vegan and GHG emissions. So this topic is quite interesting, and hopefully there's a lot of takeaways from this presentation. And also there is a lot of data and actual data, real good data from World Resource Institute, EPA. DEFRA in the UK and Australia, which have taken as part of an input for this presentation. And so I feel it should give you a good idea, but nevertheless, just use this as a starting point so that you can do your own research and decide on the points that are made in this particular presentation and take a call. Now, I know it's ethically not right to harm animals or birds, and I'm not going into that particular topic at all. This is specifically on vegan and emissions from the agricultural sector, and do a comparison compared to emissions from the remaining sectors. So it's not just about the food. That's the whole point. There's a lot of other things which actually impact our overall emissions, and being vegan is really good because it impacts the food aspect of CO2 emissions. So I'm not taking that away, but to say that somebody is vegan and they are very environmental friendly. They are very environmental friendly from a food perspective, but from another perspective that has to be really looked upon. So that's a disclaimer that it's all totally based on the data that I have, and it's based on my views or opinions, and you're free to do your research and decide on whether this presentation was useful or not. So coming to the first slide, as you can see, this is the normal process. Now, this is not the actual process which you must be going through while getting food products from the cattle. That could be milk products, beef or mutton or chicken, any kind of food material that comes from the agriculture, especially food from the animals. So as you can see, there is some level of emissions. That's basically the methane from the cows or the cattle, and also of course there is emissions from the land use and the soil, which we'll probably go into more detail as we go into the next couple of slides. But the simple process is here. We get the milk products to the the milk to the factories or food processing units, and from there there's emissions there as well, because we need electricity, and we have different suppliers that are involved for this whole process. There are some emissions that are happening out there, and then of course there's transportation that's involved in the overall processes. So there's emission coming out from the transportation, and then of course once it reaches home, there's some amount of fuel that's used for cooking, and so there's some emissions coming out from there as well. Once it goes into the garbage or possibly even landfill, there could be some emissions. So you can see the overall let's say supply chain, and you can see the amount of emissions that are coming through the whole supply chain. Now, I could have missed a couple of transport and others, and the process could be quite different at your place, but this is probably just to consider the overall emissions. It's not just the agriculture. When we say that you get food from the agriculture, there is some level of overlap between other industries where emissions are coming from. So the next slide is basically on the different sources that I've used. Some of the key ones are the WRI, which is world, and that's why it's on the top, and that's world data. And then we have the country level data. These are all data that's been kind of published quite frequently. So there's a US EPA, there's a UK source, and then there's Australia. Maybe I'll leave those inputs on the links on the description, so that you'll be able to access it. Now let's move to WRI and see what WRI says. So I've got all the 4 pages in here. So let's move to WRI. This is the World Resources Institute, and this one has 4 charts explain greenhouse gas emissions by countries and sectors. So this is not just CO2, this is greenhouse gas emissions, which will probably consider all the greenhouse gases, or predominantly most of it. So this is a very beautiful chart of the worldwide emissions. It shows 74% of the emissions are CO2, and then about 17.3 is methane, and N2O, nitrous oxide, is 6.2. So these are the major ones, and you can see the different sources of emissions. I can see that how they contribute to the total emissions, and you can see the total tons is 49.4 gigatons of CO2e, and that translates to 36.7 tons of CO2 and 0.3 gigatons of methane. That's calculated based on the global warming potential, which is pretty high for methane at 28 compared to 1 in CO2. Now the major sector, as you can see, is the energy, electricity and heat supply. So it's from the supply side where we're generating most of the emissions, and this is basically catering to all the industries, and so it's because they need that energy, and that's how it's creating those emissions. So you can see that the main sector is residential at 10.9, and then we have unallocated at 7.8, 12.4 in manufacturing and construction, 5.8 in fugitive emissions, predominantly process industries, and then we have industrial process at 5.6 and agriculture at 11.8. So now this one is a very important one. 11.8% is from agriculture, and livestock is about 5.8%, and methane about 17.3%. So I think we probably need to calculate the CO2 equivalent based on the emissions of methane, but maybe to give a rough idea, it would probably not be too high. And then we have 6.5 of land use change and forestry, and the other thing that I wanted to share was, I mean, this is something which you can definitely look at once you have an access to the link, but this is basically the diagram which shows the different sectors, how much of emissions, and how much of it is CO2, how much of it is methane, how much of it is N2O. And the key point is agriculture is 11.8, and as I mentioned, there would be some overlap of other industries like transport and let's say food processing units, but you can see the majority of it is on energy supply, which is at 30.4, 15.9 in transportation, and manufacturing and construction, and the others constitute quite significant amount of emissions. Okay, so let's leave it there, and of course you can have an access to the different other charts on WRI, and you can also even calculate how much of percentage of it is from each sector, because you have the numbers here and you have the total tons of CO2e mentioned out here. See, it's out here, so you can definitely calculate the percentage emissions. Okay, and the top 10 GHG emitters contribute over 2/3 of the global emissions. So there's countries and emission discharges at a country level. So you can see the different sources where those emissions are coming from. And what you would see is predominantly is electricity and transportation for countries like China, US, and so on. So the key point is you can find out the different sources and the proportion at this particular chart. Feel free to use it. The second one is the US EPA. This is the previous one was 2016 data. This one is a 2018 data, and this one is the also about the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And here we have the chart, very clear chart, which says 27% is electricity, 28% is transportation, 22% is industries. So these are the total GHG greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And agriculture at 10%, again close to the World Resource Institute of 11.8. And you can have a scroll down, and I think that's the total greenhouse gas emissions data. And here it does mention 9.9% of 2018 greenhouse gas emissions. So that includes livestock such as cow, agriculture, soils, and rice production. Again, this is CO2 equivalent, so we would be considering methane and CO2 and other greenhouse gas. So this is the total greenhouse gas emissions data. It's not specific to CO2. So that's with the US EPA. And now coming to the UK, this is Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. This is quite the latest one. It's published on 26 March 2020, National Statistics. Now let's move into the different sectors that are in the UK one. Okay, so the proportion of net greenhouse gas emissions in each end user sector. So this is slightly different. It's based on the end user sector. So if there is some energy that is supplied and it moves into these different sections, then 31% of it moves to transport, 27% moves to business, 22% moves to residential, 10% in agriculture, close to our WRI and the US EPA, and it covers waste management and exports, which is pretty low at 5 and 3%. So that's another data, and you can have a look at the emissions data out here as well. So this is in more detailed, and it's published in 2020. I think it talks about data of 2018. But I just wanted each of us to understand the different sources and locations where you can find the data related to greenhouse gas emissions specific to country. And if you're out of these three countries, then maybe I haven't got a chance to look at other countries, but you can use the WRI, which is covering some extent of the countries as shown before. The last one is Australia, and in Australia, again, this link will be provided, and I think this is the government source. The stationary conversion, where we're actually producing energy, that's about 52%. 15% is transport. This one is slightly higher on agriculture at 15%, and the remaining are below 10, which is 7 and 5% for fugitive and industrial process at 5. So this is another source if you're based in Australia, and you should be able to access this information. But predominantly, as you can see, the total agricultural emissions is close to 11, and 11, 10, 9 and so on. And of course, there is going to be an overlap, as I showed from the previous slide, where it's not just the agriculture, it is the overall supply chain. and there could be some amount of emissions that are coming from transport, so there will be some overlap, and industries, and also residential, and some on the waste as well. So that's the information, and let's keep that in our mind, and I will probably provide these references in the description so you can access the information. Now this is the final final slide that I wanted to show, which is this one. Okay, so this is me, and let's compare me, and that could be you, but yeah, that's different types of emissions that we contribute to. So as I mentioned before, we probably get some produce from the farm. This is showing cattle, but you could also get, in fact you will be getting some from the vegetation as well, where you're buying vegetables. So there are some emissions coming up from the farm. So just replace these cows with trees or plants or vegetables, and you're going to get emissions maybe for the land use, or for the pesticides or insecticides or fertilizers that are being used. And there is electricity that you consume, so that's another emission, which is also called as an indirect emissions, because we don't contribute it to directly, but it is done through an indirect source. So there's a power plant which generates the emission, so emissions is an indirect one. And so, and of course there is transmission and distribution losses, and so there is some emissions coming out from there as well. Maybe it's attributed to the power plant, but there are some emissions which are part of the transportation and distribution. So that's some emissions. As mentioned, the farm emissions. There's also the cooking which we do, maybe it's gas or electricity that we use, and there's some emissions coming from there as well, especially if you're having natural gas or LPG. So there's emissions, that is direct emissions that are coming out from the house, so contributing to the emissions from there. And of course, the red block that you see is the different types of products and services that we use. That includes cars, phones, fridges, air conditioners, solar panels, and so on, the plastics, petrochemicals, use of services like taxis. All of these are the key things that we buy, and so each of those are indirectly contributing to the emissions. As you can see from the previous charts, there are emissions created because there are industries that they want these energy, and so and that's how you can see that the majority of emissions are usually from the electricity and heat supply. And you can see there are supply chain elements linked to it, the suppliers and raw materials. So there are some emissions coming out from the raw materials area, where you're doing the exploration to get different types of metals or oil and gas. So there's some emissions there. And then there are some suppliers who supply those processed raw materials to the factories, and so there are emissions there. And then we use electricity, as you can see at the top, and emissions coming up from there. So I want you to just correlate this particular process with the information that we had in the previous slides, and you can see that how those electricity and transportation contribute a significant amount of emissions in most of those links, that's both on world and at a country level. So that's the key thing that I want you to take away, and see that how we need to consider the overall emissions. Vegan are helping us and trying to reduce the emissions at the food sector, and trying to kind of minimize emissions from a food perspective compared to non-vegetarians or people having beef or cattle, but the overall emissions is something which we need to consider. It's indirectly that we create this, and when you consider the overall process, that factor of food becomes really less. As you can see, it's just 11%, and livestock is about 5%. So when we're trying to reduce emissions, the focus areas are in the buying aspect, and what we need to buy, and of course the economy is one of the pillars of sustainability, so that is important that we keep our economy also going. But basically it's more about efficiency and how best you can use products at home, and and to what extent you use it or recycle it, so that we can focus on economy, environmental and social aspect all together, hand in hand, rather than just on the economics. So hope that's been useful for you to see the overall picture of emissions, and you can also have specific sources like at a country level with the link that I provided. So thank you all, and have a very good day ahead.